The first movie I ever saw twice in theaters was Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. When this movie hit theaters in 2010, I was a junior in high school and had just started my first real relationship. And it was at that time an absolute revelation for me. Its poppy, flashy editing, hard-hitting, punk-sounding music, and its litany of movie and video game references were just something that I hadn't seen in a film before. It felt like something entirely new, and before I knew it, I had the soundtrack and I had read through the entire original comic book series, which narratively I loved so much more than Scott Pilgrim vs. the World because it gave me a world where I could dig into these deep, interesting characters. It's a franchise that I've adored and loved thinking about and talking about people, and no matter what medium I engage with it. So when I saw that Netflix was bringing back the entire original cast of the Scott Pilgrim vs. the World movie and putting them as voice actors in a new anime, I was thrilled. Like, that is so perfect because you could really dive into more of what I love about this series, which is its characters. It felt like to me we would finally be getting a more faithful retelling of the actual story of the Scott Pilgrim comics, and not as much the more condensed, stylized version of Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, which I still love, but I wanted more. And Scott Pilgrim Takes Off isn't quite that, but I think I love it even more because it's not what I was expecting. Now, for those of you coming in blind who aren't familiar with the background of the Scott Pilgrim series, the Scott Pilgrim comic and movie follow the titular character, Scott Pilgrim, played in the movie by Michael Cera, and his ridiculous misadventures as he tries to start and build a relationship with a new girl in town named Ramona Flowers. But he quickly finds out to maintain this relationship, he will have to fight her 7 evil exes. You see, Ramona isn't like the other girls, because all of her exes all got together and formed a league to ruin every relationship that she would have in the future, because they're evil, because they're all evil. It's an absurd premise, but it's used in a way to actually give context to these characters, their flaws, and their problems of why their previous relationships failed, and what they need to do to improve themselves and move forward. The whole Scott Pilgrim series is absurd in a large number of ways. Characters are larger than life and act in ways that are impractical and ridiculous and would never really work in real life, but also at the same time, each and every character in the series is flawed in a very human way. Take Ramona, for instance, who finds herself to be just a bit too aloof about every single relationship, and when it starts to get serious or someone starts to get deeper, she gets scared and runs away, always hiding from her feelings and always fearing that level of commitment and trust and caring that you need to be in a relationship. And Scott is very similar, but he's also a dumb child. In fact, Scott is the quintessential version of a man-child, someone who does not want to grow up, as evidenced by the first scene in the actual movie where Scott Pilgrim is dating a high schooler. And yeah, he's 22 years old and he's dating a 17-year-old, and that's creepy. But the show and the comic and the movie all want you to know that that's creepy. And all the people around Scott who have any kind of common sense call him out on this frequently, and the fact that he is being a child. The comic successfully dives into these characters even more, and I cannot recommend that enough because I love the interactions and different kinds of storylines all of these people get up to that you wouldn't really expect. But right now, we're talking about the actual newest addition to the Scott Pilgrim canon, Scott Pilgrim Takes Off. Now, if you're someone who wants to go into Scott Pilgrim Takes Off completely blind about what's going to happen in the series, then I'm just gonna say, this is absolutely something that if you love the original series or if you're curious about Scott Pilgrim in general, I think this is a good place where you can start. I don't recommend this being your starting point. I actually think Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is a great place to start. And then if you're feeling it, you can read the comics, but you can also just jump right from the movie into the anime and you should be fine as well. It's really up to you what you choose to do here. I think all 3 of these points are viable entrance points into this series and into this story. Though, of course, the comic is the most complete one and the movie is the least time-consuming one. And the anime isn't that time-consuming either. It's only 8 episodes of about 30 minutes in length, so, you know, no matter which way you go, pick one, you'll have a good time. Science Saru, the animation studio behind this, killed it with each and every part of this series. The voice acting is, for the most part, amazing, and it's just really nostalgic to go back into this story and into this world. And even if you don't have that nostalgia, I think this anime has a lot to offer people. It might be one of my favorite animes this entire year, and Netflix especially has been killing it with anime the past couple years, but especially this year, with Pluto and Scott Pilgrim coming out so close to each other, and both of them are killer stories. I love it. Scott Pilgrim Takes Off kills it from its animation, to its music, to its characters, to its story, to its twists and turns, and subversions of your expectations that I think is just something that you're really going to enjoy. No matter who you are, you should give it a shot. But that's my little recommendation for those of you who want to go in blind. I think it's a lot of worth going into it blind, because I went to it completely blind. I didn't know what was going to happen. I had no expectation about what story they were going to tell. I didn't look at any kind of summary or any kind of anything about what they were going to do with this story, and I was pleasantly surprised and thrilled the entire way through. But if you want a little bit more, or if you're here to, have a little discussion on the actual story itself, then let's get right to that. Scott Pilgrim Takes Off, with episode 1 being almost entirely what happened in the original comic, and the beginning of the actual movie Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, almost beat for beat. You're introduced to Scott, his band, his questionable relationship with knives, and his sudden and immediate infatuation with Ramona Flowers as soon as he lays eyes on her. Everything seems to be going beat for beat just as I expected, until you get to the fight with Matthew Patel at the end of the episode. Matthew Patel, the first Evil X, was probably the most forgettable of all the X's in the series. Well, I guess actually if you're a movie fan, the Katayanagi twins are probably the least memorable characters, because they don't have any speaking lines in the actual movie. I mean, the Battle of the Bands fight was an amazing scene, but you don't really know much about the actual twins themselves. Regardless though, you don't get a lot of information about Matthew, which is a shame because he's such an over-the-top, flamboyant character. His fight with Scott starts the same way it has every single time before, with him crashing the first Sex Bomb show and loudly announcing the new League of Evil X's that will take down Scott Pilgrim. The one difference being that when Scott and Matthew wind up for their first big hits, charging in at each other, Scott's punch misses, but Matthew's lands, leading Scott to explode into some Canadian coins. Episode 1 ending on that dramatic note of Scott Pilgrim fucking dying. From there, the story of Scott Pilgrim entirely changes into something completely different. Instead of following our lovable dumb man-child protagonist in Scott Pilgrim, we're instead following Ramona Flowers and her quest to find out what happened to Scott Pilgrim, because she believes that he isn't actually dead, but he's been secretly kidnapped. Because of this, the story is no longer focused on Scott's continual boss fights with the Evil X's, and the purpose these X's serve entirely changes and shifts, as does Ramona's perspective in this show. This series, in a number of ways, feels like it's a response to the many criticisms that have been launched against the Scott Pilgrim franchise since its inception. The biggest one being that in the original series, it felt like Ramona was more of a manic pixie dream girl stereotype than an actual character with her own agency and her own thoughts, feelings, and emotions. And I think that criticism is pretty fair for the movie. I would think it's a little more difficult to level that at the comic, since it does do a little bit more with Ramona's character. You absolutely cannot say that for Scott Pilgrim Takes Off, which is why I found this to be such a compelling series that even though I had only planned to watch like one episode before going to bed, I watched the entire series in one sitting, because it is just that good. It wasn't good for my sleep schedule, but we'll get back to that later. This refreshing new take on the series also gives a lot more time to dive into each of the actual Evil X's themselves, exploring their characters, their wants, desires, and their own relationship with Ramona, and how they got to the point where they became an Evil X. No spoilers for what happens, but I just want to say I love each and every moment that I got with each of the X's, though I especially love Lucas Lee, which, I mean, I love Chris Evans' over-the-top ridiculous performance as Lucas Lee in the movie. I thought that was amazing. One of the characters I immediately gravitated to, because he was just so dumb and ridiculous that, I mean, how can you not love him?
That's actually hilarious.
I also really liked his motivations and interests that they have in the actual comic, and the way that Lucas's whole view of this is entirely different than most of the other X's entirely. And I love that we get that time with all these characters, not just because we get to dive into their characters, but also because they're really funny. This series is hilarious. Brian Lee O'Malley, the creator of the original comic, came in as a writer for this series, and his comedy exudes through every pore of this show. The animation studio behind this, Science Saru, absolutely nails this as well. Now, you may know Science Saru from hits like Devilman Crybaby or Ping Pong the Animation, but what I know them for is Keep Your Hands Off Enzoken, which is one of my favorite anime in the past 10 years. I cannot stress enough how much I love this anime and its take on animation and just creativity in general. And if you haven't seen Keep Your Hands Off Enzoken, you should just go watch it because it's so good. I love every second of that. I'm probably gonna do a video on that pretty soon, so keep an eye out for that. But Science Sorrow is one of the best animation studios out there, and they can do a lot of really unconventional kinds of animation that you don't see a lot in anime. And in this one, they do a great job of actually interpreting this indie comic style into anime. In each episode, you have these intense Sakuga moments that feel like they'd be right at home in some big shonen anime like JJK or something. But this isn't Scott Pilgrim. They're also really good at keeping a lot of the video game references and building off those video game references in a lot of neat different ways. Like with Lucas Lee, they gave him a whole section where it feels like he's in Tony Hawk Pro Skater. They don't exactly copy Tony Hawk Pro Skater, but they do what's even better than that, which is evoke the feeling of Tony Hawk Pro Skater, what it feels like to play as a skateboarder, and translate that into an animation so that it feels like you're playing a video game but you're watching a show. It's so well done. It's such a good use of the visual format and the audio that goes along with it. The sound design is amazing. The licensed tracks that they bring in here are incredible, funny, interesting, different takes every single time. It's always really interesting choices that they have, and I love each and every one of them. And the original music too is amazing. That was one of the things I always loved about Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, was that original music written by Beck for Sex Bomb. It was one of the first songs I learned on bass was Threshold, which I did because it was incredibly easy to play, but also because it's a really fun song. And the OP Bloom by Nekroitaki is such a banger as well. Both the music and the animation for the OP are amazing, but one of my favorite parts of it is there's actually a reference to Beck, a Mongolian Chop Squad in it, which is just a perfect reference, and I love whoever added that in there because I love Beck Mongolian Chop Squad. It's one of the most underrated anime to me, and it also really matches the feeling and vibe you get from Scott Pilgrim. There are so many things I could say about this anime. Each and every episode has so much to talk about, so much to dive into, so many different angles that it takes the story, and I loved it front to back. It's also only 8 episodes long, so there's no fat the entire way through. Each episode feels jam-packed with storylines, character moments, funny jokes. It always feels like it's going somewhere, and I love that in Netflix you get this ability to make series to be the length and the pace that they need to be. It doesn't feel like there's any bloat on these kind of series. The same thing happened with Pluto as well, and Pluto had hour-long episodes, and oh my god, if you haven't seen, go watch my video on Pluto because that's a series I love talking about. But Scott Pilgrim Takes Off was not what I was expecting out of a Scott Pilgrim anime, but it was exactly what I needed out of a Scott Pilgrim anime. If you are someone who has any kind of previous love or passing interest in the Scott Pilgrim series, this is an anime for you. If you haven't experienced Scott Pilgrim at all, but you kind of want something that's funny, goofy, ridiculous, and just odd, then you should give this a shot as well. This is such a weird, interesting vibe because it's based on an indie comic that had such a unique, particular sense of what the indie scene is really like, what music scenes are really like, and understanding what it's like to be in that college, post-college life where you're just kind of doing what you can to get along. It's such an interesting franchise because you don't get things that follow that kind of story that much. And you especially don't get things that become this popular. They get a movie, they get an anime, they get video games, the soundtracks, all based off it. And it's just something that I'm incredibly impressed by. I think it really deserves it, and I think you should definitely give it a shot. The point is that Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is absolutely an anime you should be checking out right now. It is only 8 episodes. It is on Netflix. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is on Netflix as well right now, so you should check that out. Also, if you have the time, it's only 2 hours long, for the movie. They're both pretty short. You can watch all of this in like a day. But thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you like, subscribe, and share. If you want to see more things like this, comment please and let me know your experience with Scott Pilgrim. I would love to hear it. I want to thank you again for watching, and I hope you have a great day, a great night, or whatever it is you're having. And stay rad.